Another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, and himself, Jonathan Fink of Silicon Curtain, of great renown across the Ukraine war YouTubes. That is his channel. Please go and check it out. It is phenomenal. In fact, it is, and I think I said this last time, Jonathan, when you were on, this is a channel that I most want to watch lots of content on, and I just don't have enough time to watch all your stuff. It's such good quality stuff. So thank you for agreeing to come on this very busy time of year. And I believe you've been out sort of Christmas shopping and whatnot this morning, so it's been a bit of a rush.
I can't complain about the trauma of doing that, especially when Ukrainians are going through so much. But, you know, Sainsbury's on Christmas Eve, it's not pretty, and yeah. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. Thank you for your words about the channel. Yeah, it's I barely have time to make all the episodes, so I don't expect people to listen to all of them religiously. But yeah, I mean, until victory, whatever that is, you know, we'll keep the pace going.
So in fact, let's talk about your channel. You've had some wonderful guests on as ever recently, you know, General Ben Hodges, who else have you've had Jake Bro, of course, and a number of other people. What, I guess, if we like look at the whole year, and we'll talk about where you think we're at and what you think is going on geopolitically. There's so much to talk about, but what things stick out for you maybe in the last month of the people who you've interviewed? What have you learned? What has made you go, oh goodness, that's some good points or some interesting information?
I think it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I try to get speakers on there that are going to push my knowledge and understanding of what's going on, because there will be a repetition, and people who've watched a lot of the videos will realize that there will inevitably be some repetition. But I do try to write unique questions for all the videos. Sometimes that's kind of impossible, but I try to rephrase them and I change the narrative flow and so on. But sometimes for me, the most stimulating videos are not necessarily the ones that get the highest audience, not necessarily the ones with anyone in the West has ever heard of. And that's often where, you know, new information hits me and it makes my questions more complex. I think, you know, to give specific examples, because people want to know which episodes to listen out for, I think the one with Maxim Eristavi, who is a Ukrainian journalist, he's also one of the sort of leading, I would say, sort of gay journalists in Eastern Europe. Which is not an easy thing to be, and he is also the self-nominated expert on Russian colonialism and decolonization. And he, you know, he's not. He didn't describe himself as an activist. I asked him whether, you know, he thinks himself more as an activist and journalist. He very much thinks of himself as a journalist, and he is researching specific areas of history and how Russia has really twisted and turned them. A classic example here, and this really hit me, some of the details here, is around Donbass, because the root of this invasion, apparently, according to propagandists, is to protect Russian speakers in the Donbass region, which is traditionally Russian. And you will still hear, even from pro-Ukrainians, this line about how Donbass is a Russian area historically. It's kind of absolutely not true. I mean, a lot of people did come from Russia in the 19th century to work, but it was a Ukrainian area. The reason why there is a higher percentage of people who have roots in Russia is because of ethnic cleansing, genocide, intentional genocide of the Holodomor, to clean out the local population so that Russians could be injected into that area and take the houses, towns, villages, streets that were essentially left empty because people starved to death. And I think Ukrainians are very specific. This was an intentional, not an accidental act. And it was designed to break the Ukrainian spirit, but also break certain values that the Ukrainians had. The farmers there were far more prosperous, in some ways, on average, more industrious, and also there was a far more developed sense of private property. And Stalin, of course, would label this as a class war, but 5 times more Ukrainians died than in equivalent famines in other areas of central Russia. So it seems to be intentional. And of course, then they shipped Russians in. But it's far worse than that. Well, that's pretty bad to start with. What they also then did is suppress the Ukrainian language. So even people who had Ukrainian roots or would have had potentially Russian and Ukrainian ancestors, they would have been forced to speak Russian to survive. They would have been forced to speak Russian if they had any ambition to get on in society, and there was huge prejudice against speaking Ukrainian. So when this narrative is trotted out of it's a Russian-speaking area, yes, Russian is spoken there, but you have to understand the historic roots of why that is, and it's pure imperialism. So the question is, do we let that stand? Do we allow those narratives to carry on and get bolder and push further into the country? Because I don't believe Russia would stop there. If we ceded Donbass to them, they wouldn't stop at that. If we ceded Crimea to them, they wouldn't stop at that. They would rearm. And we see a lot of those narratives now popping up yet again at the end of the year, especially as geopolitical analysts who know literally diddly squat about the local situation and context will trot out these kind of frameworks and ideas that may work in rule of law societies, may work in other regions, that absolutely will not work here. It will be ceding Putin a victory, ready for the next wave of aggression.
Well, this then brings me, well, what you say there reminds me of the 1991 Ukrainian independence referendum. When you look at the different regions to see that, what did they want given the dissolution of the Soviet Union? And back then you had ranging from 98.67% right down to 83.86% of people wanting Ukrainian independence in the Donbass and around Ukraine. It's only Crimea where you see a significant drop, and that goes down to 54%, which is still a majority for Ukrainian independence. And this is incredibly important. And I was telling my viewers this morning in one of my videos that I went down a pub last night and had my usual few beers with one of my closest mates, and we have this thing called, the reason why I'm ATP, it stands for A-Tippling Philosopher, and we have a group called the Tippling Philosophers, and we go and we talk philosophy. We used to do it when we were younger. Once a month we'd pick a subject and we'd go to town on it, and I'm still very close with him, and we meet up, and we just met up last night, and we usually don't even bother asking how each other are, like how's a wife, how's a kid. We just talk philosophy and politics for like an hour and a half, and then take a breath and go, oh, how's the missus? But last night we basically talked politics, and we started on, obviously, Ukraine war. And I was amazed. He's a really, really intelligent guy, knows a lot about everything, knows a lot about the world. And he didn't know what BRICS was. And I was like, that's interesting. So how can you evaluate what is going on geopolitically if you don't understand that Russia is in a group with China, India, South Africa, and so on and so forth? And there are these more nations coming in as well. So if you're evaluating what we should do and you don't understand that there's this hegemonic kind of battle going on in the world between these two power groups, then that's interesting. And then, as a pro-Ukrainian person that he then started giving me some of these real Russian talking points, like, well, NATO were encroaching, it was NATO's fault for being. I'm like, oh my goodness, right? Here's someone that you're a really close mate of mine. You are really pro-Ukrainian, but actually, is like, I was listening to Peter Hitchens, and he said this. I'm like, oh, okay. So what's happened is that the narratives, the Russian talking points, take the circuitous route around people in the UK, for example, or any country, where it then gets diluted through people who should know better, or are shills, or basically, accidentally regurgitate Russian talking points. And then that finds its way to someone who's otherwise really erudite on geopolitical matters, but it's just missing a load of knowledge here. I'm like, this, and I had to put him straight. And it's like, wow, okay, so this is how disinformation can find its way to people who I would hope would know better. And that's a worry.
And, you know, I'll put my medical hat on, even though I have no connection with the medical practice at all. Dr. Jonathan here will prescribe 3 hours of Christopher Hitchens for every hour of Peter Hitchens-itis you happen to have caught.
You're a man after my own heart, my man. Yes, yes. Like, you know, rest in peace, Christopher Hitchens. But yes, absolutely. Like, and it, yeah. And I had to set him straight. I was like, no, these are, and he's like, but these are, you know, Russian areas. I'm like, no. Okay.
It's an onion. It's like an onion. You peel away the layer, and of course, it being Russia, you can't help but bawl your eyes out. You know, every layer of the onion you peel away, but you think you've got to the bottom of it. You think, well, this is it. I've got through all the narratives, but no, there's another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And I have this with Russian friends as well. You know, they'll be like, the war's terrible, Putin's terrible, blah 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 blah, and they'll go through things which, broadly speaking, you can agree with. And then you'll hit another layer, and you'll realize that this is another layer of weaponized conspiracy theory, sort of KGB nonsense that has been created and weaponized at some point and let free in the world, you know, either planted within the right wing or the left wing extremists, because Russia, of course, seeds narratives in both. So this friend of mine came out with, yes, but, you know, NATO, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay, I'm not. She goes, but NATO isn't the real problem. There's a deeper layer. I'm like, oh, okay, this is interesting. We're going deeper. She said, actually, I don't think Putin's Russian. I think he's a plant by the global military industrial complex. You know, there's another deeper layer of conspiracy behind it. And this amazes me. I mean, people aren't content with the superficial idiocy of not just Putin, but humanity. I mean, go for the elephant in the room. Use a kind of Occam's razor on it, because Putin being a genocidal, psychopathic nut job.
It's too simple.
It's too simple. But that is the obvious explanation to it all. Unfortunately, he didn't invent any of this stuff. He's not an imaginative man. He's not a creative person. He has all sorts of delusions, but I think none of them are original. And he all sorts of psychopathies, but none of them are original either. He's tapping into decades and decades of propaganda narratives and techniques, which the Soviet Union would have developed. And previously, they recycled some of the old Tsarist ones as well, of course.
And to explain Occam's razor to people who don't know, if you have two competing hypotheses, you should, so the theory goes, prefer the one that is the simplest, as long as they both have the same explanatory scope and power. The one that unnecessarily multiplies explanatory entities is the least probable, least plausible explanation of events. So simplicity should rule, given they both do the same job. So if you're going to have some, you know, onion type of onion explanation where it just goes deeper and deeper, and it's like farm. No, the guy's just a narcissistic and megalomaniacal dictator. That's enough for me. You know, there's no need to go further.
And the counter arguments. I mean, well, because we've planted the NATO thing out there, I think what I've got used to in the channel is every time we introduce a propaganda narrative, we also have to mention the antidote, because we can't just leave people thinking, oh, okay, well, you don't think NATO's a problem, but I do, and I heard that from Joe Blogs in the pub and whatever. We have to put the antidotes out there. And the antidote is that when Sweden and Finland were due to join NATO, Russia actually didn't seem to care. I mean, it literally didn't care. Now they're making more threatening noises, but that's more to do with the threat to seize Russian central bank assets. But they literally didn't care. And if you also look at the distribution of Russian defenses, really from 2014 onwards, if NATO was the threat, right, wouldn't the western flank of Russia, Belgorod, Kursk, and these other oblasts, wouldn't they be just incredible fortifications? Wouldn't you have like a Maginot line? If you thought NATO was going to invade, if you even thought NATO was going to use Ukraine as a proxy to invade, you would have parked hundreds of thousands of troops. You'd have dug in tens of thousands of artillery pieces, dug trenches, massive missiles. Hang on a second. Where is all that stuff? Finland joined NATO, and in order to reinforce their southern and eastern front of the Ukrainian war, they withdrew all their troops. There's nothing. Finland could have just walked over that border, driven up to St. Petersburg, taken it. There is nothing to defend those obelisks because they don't consider them a threat. Compare that to the Chinese border. Oh my goodness. Now, Putin in his wisdom has apparently dug up most of the fortifications and taken the artillery pieces and tanks that were actually defending Russia against China. Why did the Soviets build massive fortifications, vast flanks of armor down there with huge stocks of munitions? Well, because it's a genuine threat. Because China has historic claim on Russian land.
Yeah, and oh goodness, we'll come back to that idea. I just want to talk about what you were saying with regard to this kind of idea of NATO encroachment. What frustrates me, and I had to say this to my friend last night, is that we need to stop seeing Ukraine as this political football that's being kicked about between NATO and Russia, and actually, and it goes back to the things like this. The polls is like, well, hang on, it doesn't matter what NATO are trying to do, it doesn't matter what Russia are trying to do. Let's look at what the Ukrainians want, right? And if the Ukrainians want to join NATO, you look at what happened, post dissolution of the USSR and Poland running straight to NATO. Let's not talk about Ukraine being this political football between two competing entities, but think about giving them the agency, the self-determination to dictate their own fate and their own future. And actually, it's not NATO's fault. It's what Ukraine wanted. Euromaidan was an expression of what they as a people wanted to do by and large. Now, of course, it's not going to be 100% of the population. And of course, there are going to be issues there. But, let's go back to the polling. And then at the same time, let's look at not just looking at blaming NATO, but why was NATO around the edges? Well, what was Russia doing, and how much was Russia getting involved? They sent little green men into the Donbass, right? They started an illegal war that Putin now pretty much admits. So it's very blinkered to say, look what NATO's done, and completely ignore Russia, and also at the same time ignore what Ukraine want themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And the language one is a fascinating one, because if you take into account the genocide, clearly, and the fact that populations were wholesale moved from one area to the other. The Crimean Tatars, we know that more than half of them died in Russian concentration camps, but they were literally uprooted from Crimea and they were shifted off to a different part of Russia. They returned in dribs and drabs, and then now, of course, they're having to flee again, and they're persecuted, and many have been arrested, tortured, and disappeared. So again, this argument that Crimea is Russia ignores pretty much all of the historical facts. Yes, it has a tendency, a sympathy towards Russian culture amongst some of the population. All these things need to be highly, highly qualified to be meaningful. And even as you were saying earlier, even in so-called experts, even in people who should be absolutely sensitive to these matters, I'm including here about a very well-known human rights lawyer who I heard speak earlier this year. They come out with utterly meaningless, grotesquely simplified statements. And you think, well, what can I do with that? I mean, that in itself is the basis of propaganda. It is grossly simplifying, manipulating, and distorting reality. And it makes it attractive because people like simplistic solutions to complex problems. If you look at a linguistic map of where there were majority Ukrainian-speaking populations, if you take that back prior to the Soviet Union, to say the 1900s, you have huge swathes of Russia that are predominantly Ukrainian speaking. If Ukraine was an imperial power, which it's not, if they had an imperial mindset, which they don't, they could lay claim to big chunks of territory. Chekhov was born in a majority Ukrainian speaking town of Taganrog, I think it's called, down in the south. Ukraine, if it was imperial, could say, hang on a second, well, we'll have half of Belgorod and we'll have that bit down there and that bit up there. Finland could quite happily claim big chunks of Russia that were taken off it earlier in the century. So Russia's on a very slippery slope here
There's a
bringing this
more
stuff up.
obvious example that I always give in this situation, which is we could march, you and I, Jonathan, we can march across, or we could sail across the Atlantic and just help ourselves to the US because, hey, they speak English. And therefore, that is a pretty good indicator they are still part of the British Empire. Thank you very much. We'll have you. Maybe there are certain areas will be less argument. We will argue less over, but you get the point. Of course, that's nonsense. Yeah. And so language tells us very, very, very little. I'm interested in, because you mentioned China, and I don't know whether what your kind of knowledge base is concerning geopolitics and China, but I've said for some time that China, on balance, wouldn't really mind Russia losing the war with Ukraine, because I think they're probably looking on and going, if they win, that's cool. We can say, hey, we're your best mates. We're ideologically aligned. Yeah, good stuff. We'll help ourselves to some of that. Thank you very much. And if Russia lose, it's like, oh, you know, you're on your feet, on your knees now, Russia. Well, we're your big next door neighbor. We can help you with your hydrocarbons. We can help you sort them out a little bit. And some of that territory just here, we'll help you back on your feet, but we'll have a little bit of that. So my thoughts is that China would actually be fine with Russia losing the war. What are your thoughts on that? I know that people think that they're ideologically aligned, but it's actually a marriage of convenience. And BRICS, I think, is a marriage of convenience somewhat just amongst all of those countries, really.
I think let's take BRICS off the table to start with, because Russia makes a big play of it. But I recently heard an India expert, and of course, for various reasons, the countries in BRICS they like the idea of being in a a non-Western aligned bloc. And that's fair enough. I mean, I actually don't think having different trading blocs in the world is a problem. If it aligns people around sort of standards, and if the BRICS then have trading agreements based on rule of law with EU and others, what's the problem in any of that? It's just adding to the layers of global rule of law and systems and standards. It's not a problem. Russia is not a rule of law country. They're not using the concept of BRICS as a way of, say, boosting the power of Brazil. They absolutely couldn't care less about any of the other countries in that bloc. For them, it's just a way of making them sound less like a mafia gas pump, mafia-run gas pump on the territory of Moscovia. And I heard India experts say, well, the BRICS is a convenient vehicle. It's a good vehicle for dialogue and various bits and pieces. Will the BRICS ever have a common currency? She said, absolutely not. I mean, that's never going to happen. This idea that a common BRICS currency would supplant US hegemony and the dollar and so on, it's absolute fantasy. And this isn't me coming up with that. That is an expert on Indian politics, who I heard speaking in Paris recently. So I think Russia has a certain amount of exaggeration of the power of that partnership, and it is purely to cover up its own terrorist action and try to get some allies in what essentially is a war it started where it's relatively isolated. Let's turn to the proxy thing, because I think China, for all its human rights abuses, and they are, of course, as we know, numerous, China is a very different beast to Russia in almost every respect. I don't think its interests are really that aligned with Russia, except that Russia is a source of cheap hydrocarbons, and it's a source of metals, resources, and so on. One of the propagandistic narratives, which is extremely popular, especially on the left, and ironically on the right, is that the Ukraine war is a proxy war arranged by the US. Well, I would agree with the phrase proxy war, but it's a proxy war of the Chinese utilizing the Russians to test Western will and resolve. That, I think, is the real proxy war that is going on here. We're failing miserably. We're failing miserably, which gives China pause for thought. Like, hang on a second, they're backing Ukraine to survive, and they're not exactly disorganized. So there's a certain amount of unanimity and strength in the West that perhaps would have surprised people prior to this. But what China is also reading is that militarily, clearly we've run our stocks down, we've run our armies down, we've run our will to respond to aggression and to reinforce, let's say, our trade routes, our values, democracy, it seems we do not have the backbone to really sort of follow through on these things.
Do you think though that that may be changing? Because I've been looking at the rhetoric of people like Olaf Scholz, and I think he is now, like when he was speaking to the SPD, his own party recently in Germany, he was talking about the existential threat that Russia is to Europe and thus to Germany. Macron was talking about this recently as well. He's been very strong on the rhetoric. You might argue that France hasn't quite done enough, at least publicly, in terms of supporting militarily, but actually rhetorically, he's had Ukraine at the top of his list for the last couple of weeks, and some of these major players in Europe are actually coming around to the idea, and Germany are now supplying that much more equipment to Ukraine, that actually there is this understanding that this is an existential threat, whilst at the same time you've got Viktor Orban's Hungary, and we've just heard news that Viktor Orban's stooges were involved in the Robert Fico election success in Slovakia. So you've got this kind of almost this Russian sphere of influence to the east, and then you've got Serbia growing a little bit in Montenegro, the Balkans under the Russian influence, but there's the large part of Western Europe is waking up to the proper existential threat that Russia is. And in light of the American impasse in Congress, which is deeply, deeply frustrating, actually Europe is kind of waking up as a potential sleeping giant that's rousing.
I think it's because there is this fear that the US is in a deadlock. I think that's because there is the fear that elements of the GOP, and let's be clear, a lot of people who watch my channel are US based, around 35%. A lot of those are GOP. And I have to be quite careful and nuanced. And I have to try and understand, US politics as much as I can, because I get roundly. And some of those will be, on the Trump cult side. So you'll have people who are pro-Ukraine, but are still part of the Trump MAGA cult. I cannot get my head around it, but those people exist, and they will fearsomely back that actually Trump did more for Ukraine in supply of armaments than Obama's administration. This is absolutely true, but it wasn't through his choice. It wasn't something he initiated. And
people have to understand that what the Department of Defense do in their kind of geopolitical, military, strategic stuff is not something the president is going to be aware of, no matter who that president is, all the time, right? He's just going to be signing off, yep, okay, I've got to work on this, I've got to work on that. Well, then what Trump did was like, oh, but some of that, you're giving some of that to Ukraine. I want some dirt on Biden, and I'm going to use that as a leverage. And that was deeply, Zelensky didn't like that at all. That was deeply problematic because that was bribery. But anyway.
Yeah, we're down a Hunter Biden laptop rabbit hole now, aren't we? But it is deeply problematic, and there are issues there, but they are manipulated and twisted and exaggerated in such a way, in a highly partisan way. I think what's waking Europe up is this idea that the problem has been recognized for a while, but the US has always come in like the big parent and sorted it out. But I think the trick here will be not to listen to Scholz's words, because his language has actually been rather strong on Ukraine right from the beginning. It's going to be the actions. For me, it's when they supply Taurus. When we see Taurus in action and Germany not flinching when those are used to take out Russian logistics in Crimea, that's when I think we will have achieved specific success. What's also interesting is the Ukrainians have started to develop their own military capacity, because quite sensibly, and I heard Ukrainians talking about this just under a year ago, they started to realize that they themselves couldn't put themselves in the position where they're dependent on NATO, where they're dependent on the West. It's good to be part of these alliances, but they cannot be totally reliant on these. In case, as we've seen, there are delays. So Ukraine is building up their own domestic production of things like armored vehicles, MRAPs, missile production. They aim to produce 1 million drones in 2024. 1 million drones. which is extraordinary. And they've retooled the Antonov aerospace works to produce not just, you know, bog standard drones, but sophisticated with, you know, anti-electronic warfare capabilities. And these are the sort of more bulky drones that have the higher kind of payloads and greater accuracy.
And also a lot of cheaper drones as well, such as
Yes.
the side drone, the AQ400,
Yep.
which is this like Shahed equivalent. So, and the fact is they've got something like, I forget the numbers, but they've got at least 40 different types of drones that they're manufacturing. So there are three elements that I see. What you're saying is absolutely right. So the situation is that analysts have to sit down, and this includes the people from these problematic countries that have potential political upheavals going on. So you could include the US in that. You could include any nation really potentially has a government that could be displaced by another one who is not sympathetic to Ukraine. So people from these countries and Ukrainians have obviously sat down and said, right, what can we do that that allows us to sustain a defense of Ukraine in light of something like an unhelpful government getting into power in a country that is helping us out a lot at the moment. And I see there are three things they're doing. One is indigenous manufacture of everything they can, and a lot of it really, really quickly. So that is something that they're working really hard on. Two is sustained contractual aid to Ukraine, which we're starting to see. So the EU, Norway started it off, the EU starting to do this, and other countries in the EU said, right, we are putting a 5-year plan in place. So that's a message to Putin to say, we are not going to just to give ad hoc aid to Ukraine. We're going to put something in place for 5 years, and we can't get out of that. And it's contractually, we'll be obligated to do that. And the third one I've completely forgotten because my MS brain. But you get the idea is that they are putting things in place to safeguard aid to Ukraine on a long-term basis.
And I think they've also realised that actually the political process is always going to be relatively slow. And let's be clear, because I saw some of the comments coming up, and Germans are quite sensitive and some are very critical of their own government. But let's be clear, Germany has provided more of this civic support aid than anybody else, including the US. And it has provided as much military aid, well, more than anybody else, including Britain. It's not quite up to the level of the US, but historically it is at a level that no one perhaps ever expected from Germany. The fact that we're in such a dire situation is that we have higher expectations further, but it has to be acknowledged that what Germany has done is quite extraordinary given the historical context. But I think the third thing you were going to mention there is the frozen central bank assets, because
that was it. That was it.
That's the most interesting one, because I think European governments and the US, and actually the majority of these funds actually reside in Europe. For some reason, Belgium, I think, is the biggest holder of Russian central bank assets, but that will work obviously within a European framework. I think we're starting to recognize that we've hidden behind all sorts of legalistic arguments. It's basically bureaucratic inertia, because there really is no, as far as I can tell, I've spoken to quite a few experts, there's no real consensus on international legislation around this. This really comes down to the will of governments and actually the culture of governments. And one of the big propaganda things here is, oh, if you confiscate Russian assets, that creates a terrible precedent. How are other governments going to trust you? And blah, and blah, and blah, and blah. Now, there are some very effective counter-arguments. One, Russia has torn up the post-war order. It has violated sovereign borders. It has created a dangerous new precedent in the world, which is practically unique. And people are going to say Iraq and this and that and the other. These weren't violations of sovereign borders. These were civil wars, bloody, appalling, awful. But the invasion, Nazi style, of territories, vast territories, and the genocide of their people and cultures is something that we thought the world had moved away from. And I know people are going to complain, yes, but what about this? And what about that? And what about the other? This is an extraordinarily dangerous precedent, in my view. So first of all, treating Russia as if it was a rule of law country and treating its funds abroad as if they abided by the same rules, is, I think, nonsensical. Russia is using the rule of law system. It is using international and local jurisdictions that have sophisticated and relatively sort of stable and transparent judiciaries, and it's utilizing that to try and stop its own funds getting confiscated. But it also entirely ignores the argument that not only Russia has, essentially raping Ukraine of its resources and stealing its children. Let's not forget, it's believed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children have been taken to Russia and are undergoing military training, brainwashing, and so on. At least 20,000 have been individually identified. And the illegality of them being moved, but it's thought the final figure is far more. Not only is Russia doing all these things, Russia has also impounded the assets of Western companies in Russia. It has stolen billions upon billions of Western assets that were invested in Russia from the 90s onwards, and it has simply taken them like a sort of bandit would. So trying to cry wolf here and say that Russia should be treated using the same jurisdictions as other countries, and other countries saying, oh, if you treat Russia like that, you might treat us like this. Well, yes, maybe. If you go around thieving the assets of foreign companies operating, then maybe you will be treated like that. But most countries don't do that. So we need to make this distinction between Russia, which is, I would say, a pariah entity. It's really not behaving as most other states in the world behave, and they shouldn't fear the same retribution. But we absolutely should take those assets from Russia. They would make a remarkable difference, and they would really turn the war around.
I mean, Carlsberg is one of those corporate entities that's been stung by Russia and had many of its kind of Russian entities taken off it and stripped, and they were pretty annoyed about that. So much so that they've just given 24,000 cans of non-alcoholic beer to the Ukrainians, which is fairly nice. But just one note about Germany as well. Yes, they're behind the US, but if you account for as a percentage of GDP or a percentage of in terms of per capita,
much further,
I wonder what the comparisons would be. But yeah, I really
actually I can tell you, because I saw this chart the other day. I mean, the US is not in the top 10 if you look at it per capita. So everyone's saying, oh, especially in the US, oh, I wish Europe would do more, blah blah blah. Just look at the statistics there. Now, that's not to denigrate what the US is doing. What the US is doing is fantastic. But per capita of GDP, the US is somewhere between 10 and 20. 30th, okay. 30th,
so yeah,
right.
So it's changed. So as a percentage of GDP, the last I saw, it moved. It was 12th, and it's now 30th. Yeah. But that'd be largely due to the last 4 months where it's completely slipped down.
Changed.
Yeah, I don't know per capita, because obviously those are two different things. But as you say, America's brilliant, and it's not to denigrate that, but it's just we need to understand that Europe is doing stuff, and there are certain nations in Europe that are doing shed loads. When you look at, Estonia, that is giving 0.25% of its GDP for 4 years to help Ukraine. That is phenomenal, and as I think some analysts were saying the other day, look, if every nation did that, then Ukraine would win that war like that. They would just have plenty of stuff to be able to prosecute successful defense of their nation.
Well, it's also been pointed out with some frustration by the Ukrainians, the reaction to the Houthi in Yemen, the Iranian-backed sort of insurgents who are sending drones to attack civil shipping in the Middle East. A vast flotilla of planes and helicopters and ships has been dispatched literally weeks since those threats began, and British warships have been shooting down, or have started to shoot down, those drones. So the gloves have come off without worrying about what Iran would do, without worrying about what other people would do. They are seeking to reimpose I would say a sort of international discipline and free shipping and so on in that space. If the same policy had been enacted with Ukraine, and I think it's very important for us to ask why the differences are there. Ukraine almost certainly would have probably won this by now. They would have been supplied with enough weaponry to push through on their counteroffensive after Kherson and Kharkiv were taken. They wouldn't have had to give Russia the sort of 6 months or so to build those incredible fortifications that then meant that their counteroffensive was relatively or less successful than had been hyped up. If Ukraine had been really, supplied to win, Russia already would have, I think, experienced a catastrophic defeat and would have fled with its tail between its legs. So we have to ask, what is holding us back from doing that?
And it's those red lines that never really existed. And if you poke the bear, it turns out the bear doesn't do an awful lot. You know, that as I'm sorry to do this for the third time, it's still bloody sat here. But for my viewers, I have this bear that I don't know why it's here. I do know why it's here, because my partner won a raffle at the local shop. So we have a pink Care Bear, but you can poke this bear, and the only red line is one on its stomach, and you can cross that red line, and nothing happens. And it turns out that is Putin. Like, he stands up very strong to weakness, and he will take advantage of weakness. But if you show strength, he's got nowhere to go, because he keeps threatening things like unprecedented reaction. There will be unprecedented consequences to X, Y, and Z. And you talk about frozen assets. It's interesting that he came out and said he didn't go as far as unprecedented, but there'll be serious consequences to these frozen assets being taken, which one tells us that that's really important to Russia. Like, if they're going to react like that, that's the same kind of reaction as there was to like ATACMS and stuff like that. So this is serious stuff. And two, he's got nowhere to go. He's giving you the same crap he's given us before. All he has is nuclear, and he won't go nuclear because of China and because of self-destruction, and that's the end of his life. And so, you know, there is nowhere they can go, and we have started to realize that, I think, and that's why we are happier to provide things like F-16s, but we could still go an awful lot further, I think, as you've intimated.
Yes, we definitely could. And of course, it opens up really tricky questions. And, you know, going back to your question about sort of speakers on the channel, there's a real disconnect between most of the Ukrainian speakers, who are almost unanimous in what they believe should happen. Most of them, most Ukrainians will say that actually we shouldn't fear the collapse of Russia. And in fact, I was reprimanded for using the word collapse, because it's unlikely to be a collapse. You know, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, but Turkey exists now on the territory, and most of those cities are there, and a lot sort of survived the transition from one imperial entity or ruling class to another entity. Care Bears don't hide in bunkers. I like that. And I think Russia would transmute into something else. This idea that suddenly Russians would run around massacring each other. Well, they've shown complete political apathy and indifference to now. And I would say the liberal intelligentsia have shown no appetite to go and fight in Ukraine. They've run away. Why would they suddenly start massacring each other in some imagined civil war? You would have messy realignments, you would have disputes, you would have unpleasantness, of course. But I think this idea of a catastrophic collapse is part of the rhetorical narrative of the propagandists. What you might have is a number of entities, and you could actually negotiate with those entities to denuclearize them in the way that Ukraine was pressured to do so, and various technological exchange programs, support, piles of money was given, and expertise to help decommission. I think it'd be far easier to, let's say, negotiate with the People's Republic of the Leningrad Oblast, for example, to denuclearize that, Yakutia and other entities. We'd have to open some more embassies, and it'd be a little more complex. We'd have to learn a lot more about these places. But I think in the end, it would be far easier to deal with, 15, 20 countries that may emerge on the territory of Russia, rather than one gigantic terroristic entity.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is a bit of a sidebar going back to something you mentioned earlier, but it is super important, this, because when we are dealing with politics and really philosophy and geopolitics and war, it's also really important to understand human psychology. So psychology underwrites a lot of decision making, well, all decision making, you know, the people that make these decisions, Putin, any other human is a psychological entity, and so they will make decisions based on what is going on in their heads, and to understand that is super important. Now, there is a great documentary filmmaker called Adam Curtis, and he's a British guy, and I'm sure Jonathan knows about him.
I should interject there. I had the rather surreal experience of having a little, or in a little group of people, where Adam was there at Pushkin House the other day. So that I found that incredibly surreal.
Interesting.
He's quite an enigmatic character, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, he does a lot of the narrations for his stuff, notwithstanding his last one. But and yeah, he sounds like quite an enigmatic person. But if you're talking about simplistic answers for very complex problems, his documentary, The Power of Nightmares, is absolutely compulsive viewing. You have to watch that. It's really good. It's 2004, I think, but it's post Twin Towers, and the idea that we wanted simplistic answers for very nuanced problems, and therefore we translated, you know, the whole Twin Towers into good versus evil, and the whole Afghanistan, you know, being a bit of a problem. You know, Bitter Lake hypernormalization take on some of these ideas and look at how we oversimplify things, and in the process of oversimplifying them, we come up with solutions that are just not fit for purpose. And I think that, you know, if you guys want to have some Christmas viewing at home that is quite highbrow, you can do no better, I think, than looking at the work of Adam Curtis.
It's extraordinary good stuff, absolutely.
Yeah,
and if you want reading to go along with it, I'd recommend, and I've talked to a few people about this, is Stanislav Lem, Futurological Congress. That's one people should read as well, because I don't know if you delved into that one. It's so Lem is a Polish science fiction writer who was active in the 60s and 70s and I think 80s maybe. People would know him from Solaris, which is perhaps his most accessible work. That's the most populist thing he pretty much wrote. But a lot of his other stuff is extraordinarily interesting, highly sort of hard sci-fi theoretical. This one, the Futurological Congress, is about his sort of character, Ion Tichy, who's an astronaut. Anyway, he's invited to this place, and he realizes that actually, you know, this wonderful sort of paradise-like place that he's found himself in is partially as the result of hallucinations that are caused by some sort of chemicals in the food or water. So he starts kind of experimenting, and as he strips away layer after layer after layer by neutralizing these hallucinogenic chemicals, he strips away one after another layer of this reality until you're left with absolute, you know, absolutely the worst. I mean, everything is the worst possible thing you can imagine, totally degraded and toxic and filthy and whatever. And even then, he's not convinced that he's managed to strip it all away. And that novel for me is almost like an allegory on Russian propaganda and how it works.
Yeah, Russian propaganda is one of my, you know, pet peeves of the world at the moment, and you know, the campaign that they are waging against basically anyone in the world and everyone in the world is truly something that is, I think, a threat to us all, far more than we previously, you know, realize. And I hope the 2024 election in the US isn't, you know, there aren't these real wedge issues that the Russians are able to hammer onto in a way that they have done, you know, for the last 7 or 8 years around the world in different elections. And they are, you know, this is really low cost, high reward campaigning for Russia. Like, why bother going to war with countries with tanks and missiles and killing your humans when you can pay a fraction of that, an infinitesimal fraction of that, set up a few buildings in St. Petersburg and wreak absolute havoc around the world politically by getting huge numbers of people on threads like the one I've already banned one troll this morning, and there's another one on the threads just spreading that's what they do, just cause discord and havoc and spread disinformation, and have great success in so doing, to the point where, you know, you've got members of Congress in the US regurgitating the claim that Zelensky has bought himself these yachts and that his wife spent $1 million in New York on jewelry, like in Congress, saying that, and as a reason to not give money to Ukraine because it would go to these ends, when that is not true, and that is stuff that is coming straight out of the Russian disinformation books. It irritates me. I'm starting to get angry. I don't know what your thoughts on that Jonathan are.
Oh, yeah, I'm muting myself there. You can hear me now. This really is the origin of the channel. I mean, this is why I started the channel, because, and I ought to have started it far sooner. Back in 2016, I saw the weaponization of narratives and the failure of Remain to actually counter them and engage with those narratives in a constructive way. You know, the choice was to attack the negativity as opposed to creating alternative vision, you know, rather than saying, well, this is why it's so important not to leave. Rather, they attack the negativity of the Leave campaign, and that doesn't work at all. My marketing career tells me that you cannot market negativity unless you are like Russia, nihilistic, and you're looking to tear things down, destroy and divide. If you want to build something, you cannot fight negativity with negativity. All you can do is to create a alternative universe of values and hope people are immersed in that. And by doing so, they see the false world that's been created by propaganda for what it is. So I've been tracking these narratives really intensively since 2016, and of course you start to see the ebb and flow of them in foreign policy, Russian disinformation, both external and internal. But also, when I lived in Russia, one of my favorite hobbies, which is a little bit obscure and weird, was to try and track mythologies. Whenever I heard people talking about things, it just something struck me about the phrases people use, and they use them over and over, and they use similar language, and it's used to sort of shut down ideas, shut down debate. And I started to realize that historical mythology is this incredibly powerful thing. Now, all countries have mythologies. Let's not sort of pin this entirely on Russia. Britain, no less than other places, has certain sets of mythology, but we also don't ban the study of our history. We don't ban people who are prepared to investigate it and create alternative, a more nuanced and layered narratives. Russia absolutely does. Russia tries to control the past as well as the present.
They've got completely revisionist approaches to history at the moment. Like, they've just been rewriting their textbooks, and they're including like the account of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. Now, I know history is written by the victors, so our understanding of history will be colored by our own cultural baggage and whatnot. But like, that entire revisionism is truly horrible. But yeah, sorry, I interrupted.
No, not at all. No, in our politics, as I said, because one of my favorite subjects of history was histography, or the study of how the study of history changes and interpretations that are placed on it. And of course, you know, intellectual discourse, trends, fashions change in the West. Sometimes they're driven by events, but often it changes from one generation to another. You know, a new generation of academics will say, actually, you know, that's all great, but I want to do it differently. I want to explore things. I don't want to explore the history of great men. I want to explore more of a sort of, you know, democratic history. And so you'll have trends and so on, certainly in the West, and it will change the way history is studied. But what Russia is doing is something entirely different. It's much more like the sort of Stalinist images where, you know, one guy was super popular or whatever, not popular. One guy was sort of part of the inner circle, and then he falls out of favor, and so they wipe him out of the picture. Russian history is far more centrally controlled, far more driven by ideologies, and it's far more subservient to power and the interests of power in the present. Now, of course, there's always going to be efforts to try and rewrite history. Currently, there's a huge debate around Churchill and a certain amount of politicizing on both the extreme left and right about, one throwing out everything to do with him, and the other one which is trying to throw out all the negative things and just create this rosy picture. So we have elements of that going on here, but it's framed as a debate, and no one's going to go to prison for putting one or the other argument. It may be vitriolic, but no one's going to be behind bars for doing it. In Russia, it's a very, very different story. And it's not just Putin. Let's be clear. These historical narratives, all empires will create them to try and manipulate the narrative and keep people behind the imperial entity, because running an empire is an incredibly costly thing to do. So you have to make sure people are really aligned with the sacrifices and costs of doing it. Russia is an inefficient empire, so it's that much more costly to run.
Was it on your channel or Ukraine the Latest? I think it might be in your interview with a KGB historian, FSB historian. Have you spoken to any? And
yes, Yuri Felshtinsky would be one potentially.
Yeah, and talking about how the KGB were at odds with the Communist Party. They weren't like, integrated, but they're at odds with each other. And actually, so many people died during, communist Soviet Union history due to the KGB like killing them and basically executing them. He was saying tens of thousands, maybe dozens and dozens of thousands of people. And that whole history that he was expressing, and the idea that it's just also centrally controlled, and that it's controlling the narrative, and what is it? Is it from George Orwell? He who controls the past controls the present, controls the future, whichever way around it is. The idea is you control your history from the past, then you're like, controlling who people feel they are now, and it's a way of controlling where you're going forward, so on and so forth.
I mean, it's an extraordinary creative work, 1984, but if you study Russian history, and especially the Stalinist period, you start to realize that actually it was not a huge leap for Orwell to come up with his ideas. They're not that it's a great fictionalization, but he really didn't have to look too hard to actually see the precedents for that. I find Huxley's Brave New World a far more interesting or imaginative piece, because you really have to extrapolate out from present trends. And the guy who preceded them both was Evgeny Zamyatin, a Russian writer who actually wrote the proto version of both of those novels. In some ways, I find it better than either of them. And he wrote it shortly after the Russian Civil War. An extraordinary leap of the imagination. Wow. You don't have to imagine too much that Stalin did not like that. Someone who pointed out the logical outcome of the Bolshevik experiment long before it was apparent to anybody else. That's a dangerous character. But his novel is called We. It's an extraordinary work of imagination.
Interesting. I'll have a look at that in a second. Just while we got a chance, you mind if I just say thank you to a few supporters of the channel. So FU Russia, tell it how it is there. Thanks for the stream. Great to hear both of your views. Thank you very much, FU Russia. And quite frankly, FU Russia at this point in time, or at least FU the Kremlin. GMT Politico, who has been out in Ukraine, I believe, and is presently possibly in Germany. If you support Trump and Ukraine, know this: if he wins the White House, kiss Ukraine bye-bye. So that is certainly one view, and it's a view I would broadly support, but I know that might be contentious for some. Thank you so much, GMT. So great of you to support the channel. Ed Delvers gifted 5 memberships. Thank you very much for that, Ed. And Don, 50 memberships to those. So that's incredibly generous. And finally, for now, happy holidays, Mr. P. Appreciate your hard work. Thanks, Parrot Andy. Really appreciate your support of the channel. Now, something I wanted to come on to, Jonathan, was something that Putin has been touting, supposedly, according to sort of leaks and whatnot, this idea of a ceasefire. And I always think in terms of, so just to let people know, the last couple of days, it's been sort of thought that Putin is ready to negotiate for a ceasefire at the moment. And I think of these these sort of events in terms of playing Monopoly, which is when you're playing Monopoly and you've bought all the properties on the board and everyone's got their properties, but no one's quite got an entire set, or some people have got a set there, but they want some more. And whenever you offer a deal to someone else, you know that initial deal is going to be in the favor of the person offering the deal. Like, no one goes, oh, I know what would be fair for both of us. This is a zero-sum game. So like, you doing well is me doing less well. So if I'm going to go and do a deal with someone, it is going to be to my benefit. So as soon as someone offers you a deal, straight away, it's like, that's not really helping me as much as it's helping you. So if I need to do some kind of haggling here, and that's what. So Putin is like, yeah, thinking about doing a ceasefire or some kind of negotiation. It will be to his benefit. And so if that's going to get appeasers in the Western world, oh yeah, let's have peace, let's do some negotiations, that will be to Putin's benefit. This is not the time for Ukraine to do a negotiation. What are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. Putin has clearly stated what his aim is. I don't believe his war aims have changed at all. Pretty much 99% of Ukrainians I've spoken to would entirely agree with this, and that his aim is the erasure of Ukrainian statehood, and the recreation of territories within the former Soviet sphere. We don't know the full extent of those, but certainly there's a lot of genocidal rhetoric now being directed at Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and other territories to the south. We know Moldova was potentially on the hit list for the initial invasion when he looked to take the southern corridor all the way through to Moldova and use the Transnistria as a kind of as an armed base. In order to take the whole of Moldova. So I don't think his ambitions have changed. What has changed is his capacity to project and inflict violence. He is realizing that he's in a far more vulnerable position than he'd like to be, and he needs time to rearm. It may be that after a ceasefire, he comes after Ukraine in a few years. It may be that actually he decides that, okay, let's freeze this conflict and let's start somewhere else, because he's built a system that requires conquest. He's built a system that requires eternal war, from the Siloviki through to the administrative classes, the new class of entrepreneurs in the military-industrial complex that's being created, to the turbo patriots. He's built a system where if you switch off war, it will collapse. But at the same time, if you push war too hard without results, it will collapse. It's an incredibly difficult tightrope for him to tread. So he may well decide to go after territories which are low-hanging fruit or a soft underbelly or whatever you might want to call it. That's not the Baltics, because that will potentially generate a harsh rebuke from NATO and Europe. He may well start going after Central Asia. Republics and so on, which don't have the same, ability to defend, and which may have, substantial Russian populations who could be utilized or weaponized or used as an excuse. He may just be looking to throw this idea of a peace deal out, knowing that Ukraine and us will reject it, and then he can weaponize that narrative. Oh, look at me, I want peace all along. It's the West who are the aggressors, blah, 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 So he can utilize this in a variety of different ways. Would he ever stick to a peace treaty? No. Minsk 1, 2, 3, absolutely hopeless. Russia was breaking those almost the minute they were signed.
His form on any treaty, the Ukrainians have said this countless times, is like, why would we do a deal with him? He's broken them like routinely. I mean, when I look at something like this kind of opinion, for me, like anyone that says I think a ceasefire is good, all you're doing is communicating to me that you're either a Russian troll or you're not really thinking very well, because a ceasefire is only going to help Russia. So all you're telling me is you want Russia to prevail. Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
That if that's what you want, we're going to disagree.
Sorry, Dougie, but it's delusional. It's entirely delusional, and it lacks any nuanced understanding of the Russian or Putinist mindset.
But you mentioned something that I find really interesting. Everything you've said, I find really interesting, Jonathan, to be honest. But you mentioned that Putin might take other countries in his crosshairs and go, right, let's have a go at doing that. If we can't succeed, or we can succeed with Ukraine or whatever. What are your thoughts on the actual reality of Putin going into somewhere like Poland or the Baltics or Finland? This idea that he won't stop at Ukraine, because my general idea is that he just won't have the ability. Like, Poland could beat Russia in a land war right now. Just so certainly now he wouldn't have the ability to do that. But there are some analysts that are saying, and some intelligence outfits are saying, that he could gear up to go to war with Europe sometime in the future. What are your thoughts?
Yes, definitely in the future. So let's divide this between intent and ability. So we mustn't doubt his intent. If he thought he could get away with it, he would absolutely do it. If he thought he had the strength to do it, he would absolutely do it. And if he thought there was no serious repercussions, he would absolutely do it. So let's be absolutely clear about that.
Really good point.
But we know he does not have the strength to do it. So Russia cannot remain as even the internal empire that it currently is, with the degraded and depleted armed forces. And let's be clear, all this debate about stalemate of the Ukraine counteroffensive, it hasn't achieved its overhyped objectives. But what Ukraine has done is shift the war into an attritional phase, and Ukraine is getting huge losses from that. But the ratios are far worse on the Russians, and not just in manpower, because manpower, Russia clearly has more manpower it can draw upon. The ratios of losses of artillery pieces, armed vehicles, heavy equipment is really bad on the Russian side. From really outgunning Ukraine more than 20-1 at the start of the war, those ratios have dropped dramatically. And yes, it's getting munitions from North Korea, but the quality is entirely variable. And we hear in reports that gun barrels are blowing up because of deficient munitions. So Russia is in a vastly weakened position compared to where it and many Western analysts thought it would be at the start of the full-scale war. So what's Putin going to do if he wants to carry, if his system is dependent on war, on forever war, to the end of his life, which it pretty much we believe is. And this isn't just me, this is many of the Russian analysts I've spoken to. How is he going to stock his army again? He's going to need to get huge numbers of people from somewhere. He's already started to corral migrants in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other places. He's really assiduously trying to avoid conscripting or mobilizing the Russian-educated, sort of more middle-class type people, and in the capitals, he's trying to avoid that. So he's going after migrants from Central Asia. So once they've hoovered up all of the migrants, which of course will be to the detriment of the Russian economy, because a lot of the construction is actually done by people from those republics. Well, if he's able to take and weaponize, one of the Central Asian republics, suddenly you've got a huge population who can be militarized, and then you shift that population, and then over maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years, you start to have the capacity once again to continue your aggression. So I think it's even more insidious when you look at how he will be building up his military offensive capability. It's going to be by enslaving other, not just internal populations, but other external populations.
Yeah, and this is why, you hope, and I know that Vigo, who's such an awesome supporter of the channel, but Vigo said here, Russia's at a fifth of the pre-war capacity. I would qualify that very strongly here to say Russia has lost arguably 87% of the forces that it started the war with. But of course, that means they haven't just lost that and then sat there with nothing. So they've replaced 87% with basically new conscripts with no experience at all, and mobilized people. And so they still have the forces. It's just the force quality is a lot poorer. But the same can be said to some degree, or to a large degree, with Ukraine as well. And so this is a challenge for Ukraine, is boots on the ground going forward. I think is the single biggest issue Ukraine have. I think when it comes to weapons and ammunition, they will get there. Like, the West will eventually gear up. We are rearming or that's probably the wrong word, but we are revamping our military industrial complexes to help Ukraine, albeit a little too slowly, but it is happening, and I think it will happen. and I think Ukraine will get the help it needs, but we can't provide human beings, and Ukraine has to do it itself. So they have to fight a war where the attrition takes place from a distance, is my opinion. And they don't fight on the front lines. They fight with missiles, and they fight with airplanes, and they fight with distance munitions and drones. But that's my tuppence.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not happening fast enough, but it is nonetheless happening, and the wheels are starting to turn. I think one of the real realizations is that the US may be dusting off some of its capacity, other countries doing the same. Finland actually out in the forefront of building its capabilities. Korea never really stopped. I mean, Korea is remarkable in terms of its capacity to produce munitions, probably because you've got the, North Korea, and that threat never went away. But even at the current production levels, I think this was Ben Hodges mentioned this, the annual output of 155mm shells would last about 2 weeks on the Ukrainian front. So we may be dusting off our capacity, but we have not put our economies on a war footing. The narrative next year needs to change from as long as it takes to oversupply munitions to Ukraine. I mean, oversupply to win, and win within a designated period of time. It's got to get far, far more committal, the language. I was in Paris, and I can tell you the language amongst the military people who were there was still vague and unhelpful.
This preempts this question from SK here. What do you believe are reasons the West has not yet declared the goal to defeat Russia in Ukraine and put the resources into the project, and to not provoke the Russians or not to provoke other countries? I mean, what's the reason why it has been so vague?
Yeah, I think the UK are out of most countries, and in this, I would say the UK, the Baltics, and the Nordics are actually fairly clear that they're not that worried about a major Russian defeat. The challenge there is that Britain, within Brexit, within the budget constraints, and the fact that we've had decades of winding our military down, mean that we simply don't have the capacity to back up that will to support, unfortunately. And, we should have perhaps geared up our factories and so on last year, and that hasn't quite happened again, probably for the same sort of reasons, budgetary constraints and issues following the Brexit debacle. Sorry, that's going to upset a lot of people, but there it is. But Britain, I think we don't fear a Russian collapse. It's like, I think we accept Russia needs to be defeated. The big mindset problem seems to be in the sort of old Europe, central, that would be France, Germany, and of course Washington. And I've been saying this for several months. Finally, people are starting to cotton on to this, and they're looking at the utterances of Jake Sullivan, who is the architect of the US policy. Very much Biden is guided by this guy. I believe ferocious debates are probably happening between him and Blinken. Blinken is
because I think Blinken is very much more supportive of Ukraine, more overtly.
And he's more, let's do this to win and do it sooner. Jake Sullivan is saying interesting things. He's saying a lot of the right things about the morality of the war, but he's not saying the right things strategically. And he really seems to be, I would say, conditioned by the realists in geopolitics. He's conditioned to fear Russia, and he's conditioned to fear so-called Russian collapse and a world without the Russian Empire. And unfortunately, that betrays I think a lack of historical context and understanding, a very dangerous and lethal lack of understanding about what needs to be done.
Yeah, he's also come under a lot of stick for the sorts of failed coalition of US Navy in the Red Sea, but that's a whole different kettle of fish, because that appears to be got off to a pretty dodgy start. I want to just rewind a little bit, if you don't mind, as we sort of meander towards some kind of
to a close. Yes,
meander towards a vague conclusion. So thank you so much, Mark Bisque, Canadian Canadian, Ukrainian Canadian, who is such a firm supporter of the channel. Thanks to Don for gifting me a membership. Merry Christmas to all. Thank you, Jonathan, for recommending 20 Days in Mariupol. We had to watch it in intervals, pausing often, very painful and enraging for us to watch. And I just want to say another couple of things here on top of that. The footage from 20 Days in Mariupol, released in March 2022, galvanized my support for Ukraine. And I watched 20 Days last night. I'm an ex-military and an ex-prison officer. I had to stop about 5 times due to both anger and sorrow. So I suggested people watch this the other day. It's been around for some time, but actually it's up now for two Oscars, and it is a great piece of footage. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because you were talking about disinformation, and I remembered that bombing of the Mariupol hospital. This is the first 20 days of the war, like right at the beginning, and that hospital, the maternity unit that was bombed in Mariupol, where we saw a pregnant woman, very heavy with child, being brought out of the maternity hospital and having to be taken elsewhere. And these guys with these Associated Press cameramen and reporters were filming this, and they eventually followed her. They couldn't find out where she went, and then they did track her down, or they tracked down someone who treated her, and they said unfortunately her pelvis was crushed, the baby was dead inside the womb, and she ended up perishing as well, and so they both died. And they filmed all these people that were coming out the maternity hospital. They filmed, you know, where they went and what happened to them, the beginning, middle, and end. But straight away after that happened, the Russians were out there saying these were paid actors. This was and the whole narrative was like, and people believe that. Unfortunately, it falls on fertile ground. And it's like here, I mean, it's an incredible film, 20 Days in Mariupol, but there's absolutely no doubt these are real people suffering horrendously. I mean, you see dead babies, you see all sorts of stuff in that documentary, and it is harrowing. But you have to see that. You have to see that to realize that if you're going to paint this as fake, then you are freaking evil. Like, and this is where I start getting on my moral high horse and start getting angry, because it's despicable. It's despicable that you would try and spin this as some kind of fake event. And so it's just that just go and watch it, guys. Go and watch it. I presume you've seen it. Have you seen it?
I couldn't watch it all the way through. I'm about 2/3 of the way through, and it's taken me about 5. It'll take me about 5 sittings to get through it, because it's deeply disturbing. And having now knowing, you know, very well dozens of Ukrainians from the interviews, and having interviewed many dozens more, and met others when I was doing the conference. And of course, you know, it's easy in some ways when you don't know the language to distance yourself, and it sounds alien, and it doesn't sound familiar when people talk. But speaking Russian, you can just hear it, and the immediacy and the dialogue, and you can relate that to real people that you know, I've met and spoken to, and yeah, so it's that much more harrowing when you can see how real it is. And you know, because I try to imagine, I think it's a useful but disturbing experiment. I try to imagine what a Russian victory would mean, and if you extrapolate that 20 days in Mariupol to the entirety of the country of 44 million people, then it becomes a horror show on a scale which perhaps even the Nazis would find impressive, you know. And I know people, and I know refugees from Mariupol who've told me their stories directly, and showed me pictures of their apartments before and after. And yeah, it's unfortunately. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me when I watched it, one of the things that upset me deeply was lots of it, but upset's probably, I guess, made me angry, was there was this shop that had been that people were, no, it wasn't a shop, it was like some kind of, I don't know, alcove area where people were hiding because there was shells raining down. And this was right at the beginning of the war, and you had some Ukrainian policemen, soldiers, like ushering people in there, like all, like, you know, it was all going off. And you have some people are like, what's going on? What's going on? Who's doing this? And there was one guy that was shouting, it's the Ukrainians shelling us. It's the Ukrainians shelling us. And you're like, like, oh my goodness, like even in the midst of the Russian army invading Mariupol and bombing the shit out of this town, this city, this once beautiful city, you have people going, well, this is the Ukrainians doing it to us. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian police and army are there going, like, guys, be safe, get into here. And like, that is the disinformation. Also, not just disinformation, but the idea that there are pro-Russians, of course, that exist in all of these places, that plays merry havoc with the kind of narrative.
It does. And you know, the middle ground is equally fertile for Russian propaganda. And I think this is quite a good idea to sort of end on. And that is, there are many people who understand, yes, it's the Russians doing that. There's many people who understand that you know, Ukraine is kind of fighting back, but all they want is peace. And you will hear, and I've spoken to many people who will say, well, you know, it's a complex situation, and there are many things going on that we don't understand. You know, there are many things going on that will only become apparent later. And that to me is another highly effective, probably the most effective propagandistic narrative, because people disenfranchise themselves. They take away their own political agency. They refuse, in some ways, to research the problem. They refuse to take a side. They refuse to become activists. They simply say, well, there are people who know more about this than I do, and we can't know everything there is to know. And that completely absolves the aggressor of their aggression, in my view. And that is one of the most effective narratives that Russians really try to put around. It's not to make you take action or make you believe point of view. The most effective propaganda is to make you almost indifferent, make you think you're powerless, make you think there are forces beyond your control, and there are secret processes at work that you won't really understand and probably shouldn't even try to. And that's
how the Russian population is so pliable, right? Because they are disenfranchised. They've spent 100 years having no political power. They flirted with democracy in 1991. That failed because it all went to corporatism and oligarchy and kleptocracy, and now you're left with people that don't know how to be political. You just don't know how to do it, and so you can just take advantage of them. They are ripe for the picking. It's really frustrating.
That's right. And the reason why Ukraine is at war is because not everyone is an activist, not everyone is political, but a much higher threshold, a critical threshold of people are political and have been activated, as it were, by events, the multiple revolutions and post-independence, rediscovering their often individual or family pasts, and then looking beyond that to their cities and their areas and then Ukrainian history as a whole, and they're starting to reclaim their identities. And that is a form of activation. That is why I do, you know, many interviews on the arena of culture as well as politics, because I see the two actually as indivisible, in the same way that Russia will weaponize its own culture and burn up its own cultural heritage for its imperial ends. So you can't divide culture and sport from Russian imperialism, because they're all weaponized. They're all used as part of this aggressive warfare. Again, on the Ukrainian side, culture, activism, identity, these are all parts of the same sort of complex process of creating a civil society and a public space, and a space where people can disagree, but disagree without sort of killing each other and stealing everything.
It's kind of a nice way of existing. Can I just say thank you to Richard Bennett? I did share this before. Richard Bennett, Peter van der Ruyt, really kind, and Steve A. I shared that before. Thank you. Brian Ivy, always a great support of the channel. Thank you. And so TTT here says, Norway is supporting Ukraine. We have long experience with Russia and being occupied during World War II. Keep up the good work. Merry Christmas. Regards, Tahir from Oslo. And the Nordic states and the Baltics. And you can argue it's from self-preservation as much as from a moral standpoint, are such staunch supporters of Ukraine, and long may that continue. Thank you, Borgfellow. NATO never accepts a ceasefire in the information war. Good stuff. John Larkin says, moving forward, when Ukraine are victorious in Crimea, how will the Tatar minority be dealt with, as we have seen how the Kurds were treated? I can't talk to that, and maybe that's the last sort of thing you might have some idea of.
Well, yeah, I mean,
What
Ukrainians. I mean, I've not heard any stories of Ukrainians suppressing Tatar
no.
identity and political agency. It's the Russians who do that. It's the Russians who burn school textbooks. It's the Russians who torture people for expressing their culture and speaking their own languages. So you would see Tatars being able to return and engage in politics. And again, this is another great myth of the Russian takeover of Crimea. They stormed in and they forced the parliament to vote down the barrel of gun, literally telling anyone who was going to oppose them they would be taken out and shot. So this idea again that somehow Crimea wanted to be Russian, that its political entities wanted to be Russian, this is all a terroristic cover story, and people really need to sort of read up on the nuance, the detail behind it. And if you've watched, or if you're about to watch 20 Days in Mariupol, there's another film out. It's free to watch. If you can share that with your audience, I think this is really important. It's called To the Zero Line. It takes a very, very different tack. And it's very intentionally created to focus on the persecution of deeply religious minorities, including Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodox, not the sort of FSB created entity, which is the Russian Orthodox. But this is a film that's very much designed to try and appeal to, especially in the US, those who may be of a religious persuasion, and to get away from this idea that Ukraine is suppressing religion. Ukraine is a deeply, I would say, sort of spiritual and far more organically religious country with richer heritage than Russia is, and this is one of the things Russia wants to lie about and suppress. So this is another bit of holiday interest there for people who are pro-Ukrainian.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a really good tip. I look forward to watching that, although I'm sure it'd be a tough watch, as the warning indicates. Just kind of as we go into the final stretch here. So Greg Terry experience. So Greg Terry is such a great channel to work with. He is going out to Ukraine in January very shortly to do his volunteer work that he does such an amazing job with. And he says, love you, my friend JP, grateful for your work and for friendship. And if I do get out to Ukraine, I'm hopefully, which I do want to do, but my mobility and health issues are a little bit of a sticking point. I'd love to go and hang out with him and with Pierre, who is out there working as well. So thank you for that, Greg. And SI USA 54, as ever, I'm blown away by your generosity. Merry Christmas, Jonathan. By the way, 20 Days in Mariupol is available on YouTube at Frontline PBS channel. You can watch that for free if you're American, if you have an American IP address. But in the UK or elsewhere, you're probably going to have to pay. I went and just got that through my cable provider and just rented because put money where good filmmaking is concerned, and hopefully some of that finds its way back to Ukraine.
And if to wrap up, people want a recommendation from my channel, if I can just do a little bit of a plug there.
Please do. I was going to do a big long ending for your channel.
Oh, right, excellent. Well, there's a couple of specific videos I think people would really enjoy based on our conversation at the moment. So one of the links I've just sent you, and it's a video from November, and it's with a guy called Grigor Atanasian. He is one of the key researchers and journalists and scriptwriters behind Alan Curtis's films. So we interviewed him on the channel, and the episode is called Bloggers, Blood and Circuses, and it's relating back the sort of the public entertainment of war and aggression, and relating it back to how the mechanic of the Roman Empire kind of worked as well. So this is quite a good one to watch. I'd also recommend people watch Maxim Eristavi. This is a more recent one, and that's on Russian colonialism. And just a little heads up for Christmas Day, that's that one there. On Christmas Day at 3:00, we've got a Christmas message from Ukraine. For those of you who watch her channel, I would say she's the queen of Ukrainian YouTubers. Anna Danielchuk is going to be giving us a Ukrainian Christmas message at 3:00 on Christmas Day tomorrow. So watch out for that one.
That's nice. So the reference there in UK, we have the Christmas message from the Queen every year that comes along at a certain time. I'm not sure how many people still watch that. Of course, it's not the Queen anymore; it'll be the King. Yeah, I guess that is the alternative. Thanks very much to Johnny Christensen. Merry Christmas, Jay and Jay. Johnny F from Denmark. That's really kind of you, Johnny, and Merry Xmas, Jonathan, and Silicon Curtain from Michael Michaels in New Zealand. Kia kaha, bro. That's my Kiwi accent on show for you. Can I just say a massive thanks? This is an insanely generous audience I have, so thank you very much. And as I have been saying a number of times recently, you know, Merry Christmas to you all. And Merry Christmas to Jonathan. But as Jonathan intimated at the beginning, you know, let's remember there are people fighting in trenches over this time period. So I was fretting earlier because, you know, Helen hasn't got hold of any cauliflower, and we need cauliflower cheese for our Christmas lunch. And so she's been out and having to get frozen cauliflower. What's going on there? As if this is like a huge issue. There are people fighting in trenches. So, you know, enjoy Christmas, of course, enjoy Christmas, but spare that little thought, or maybe a big thought, for the people who are far less fortunate than ourselves, who are fighting perhaps in some way for us, on behalf of us, in some way that can be connected to your lives. You know, people are putting in the effort in Ukraine, and just, you know, let's remember that. Jonathan, do you have anything final to say today?
No, that's really I think the most important thing to remember there, and the conditions they're fighting in are extraordinarily bad. And the intensity of that fighting is really terrible. Let's make 24 a year where this turns around and the West grows a pair, stands up to Russia, stands up for its values. And as I say, I'm gonna keep repeating this catchphrase: oversupply Ukraine, give it everything and more that it needs to win, rather than hedging our bets. And then I think we will see the world become a far better place if Russia is pushed back in its box.
Amen, brother. I couldn't have said it better myself. Let's continue the work that we all do. I'm talking to the audience, and obviously Jonathan and I will continue the work that we do. All I implore is that every single person watching this at the moment, there's 366 of you watching as far as I'm aware, every single one of you, if you haven't subscribed to Jonathan's channel, Silicon Curtain, what are you doing with your lives? Like, honestly, are you there? Come on, guys, do it. Go and subscribe to Jonathan. The work he does is phenomenal. I dream of having the quality of interviewees that he has and giving the quality interviews that he does. So go and help out his channel, please. In the meantime, look, thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate this, and I really love these chats. And if you're up for a new year, having a go at it again sometime in January,
Absolutely.
February, let's do this again. And you know what? I had John Sweeney on, and we had a chat, and he's from Hampshire, and he's like, we'll have a drink when I'm back in the area, and I'm going to bloody hold him to that. So I don't know where you are in the world. Oxfordshire.
That's
pretty far away, but mate, I mean, well, you're welcome to come for a drink with John and I. I'm sure it'd be fun.
That would be tremendous fun, and if you got a sofa I can pass that on, then they'll make it happen.
Definitely, there's a spare room with your name on it. Excellent stuff. Well, you stay on the line, Jonathan. Thank you so much to everyone in the live chat. I will be doing a video on Christmas Day because I am that sad. I will find half an hour to do one, but in the meantime, and then do one. In the meantime, thank you to my guest, and thank you for the insane kindness of all of you supporting the channel. Like, without that, I can't do what I'm doing, and I still feel that this is such an important subject that I have to keep doing this, and Jonathan likewise, I'm sure will reiterate that sentiment.
Definitely.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Final sentence, Jonathan.
Oh, am I out of words? I don't know if that's possible. Stay tuned next year. we're going to be doing a lot of stuff to support Ukraine. The channel will carry on producing its sort of almost an interview a day, or 5 major interviews a week, plus a news summary. We're going to have hopefully a second channel that will, reissue conversations like this and any public events where I might be present. It's going to be doing shorts. I'm going to be turning the videos into shorts, because that is quite a powerful format, especially to get through to the younger demographic, and a lot more events in the real world. And heads up, there is a book coming as well. So there's a contract to turn the best of Silicon Curtain interviews into a book sometime in the first half of next year. So watch this space.
Wow, that is incredible. That is really, really good. I mean, I'm into publishing myself and writing books too. So that sounds really good. I'll have to talk to you about that at some point. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Speak soon. Merry Christmas.